supper. If you're not, just feel free to continue eating. But we are going to start so we can start on time. And I think most of you know me. I'm Julie from the office. And Paul said to make an announcement that you should go to our Facebook page and see him getting a pie in his face. Oh. Yes. I believe it was for a fundraiser for Parkinson's. So take a look at that. He's always up to something. Thank you all for coming out tonight. It's such a lovely night, and I'm glad you chose to come here rather than, go for a walk or something. It's nice weather. So,
before too long.
Yeah. And tonight, I'm really excited to have Steve Sims here. I have heard Steve speak a couple of different times on a couple of different topics. But we've had several requests from caregivers recently to do something around this topic because we've been losing some of our longtime clients now. And some of you have been with those people for years, and they become just like family and friends, and it's not easy when they leave us. And so this will benefit all of us, I think, as we do our work with our clients. Steve is with Fairview Services. He worked for 20 years with Fairview Hospice as a chaplain, and now he's one of the managers of Fairview Hospice. So he has given support and guidance to hundreds, maybe thousands, right, of patients and family members as they work through their grief. And prior to coming to Fairview Hospice, Steve was a teacher and a school administrator. So welcome, Steve, and thank you for being here.
Hey, Julie. Well, thank you for this opportunity to talk to you about really a tough subject, but it's a subject that we all encounter sooner or later. And we've all been on this planet long enough to experience loss and to see how other people grieve. And so what we'll be doing tonight is talking about some of the real basics with grief and loss. Hopefully I can give you some new insights, some things to think about that you haven't been aware of. I have worked in the area of grief now, she said, for the last 20 years, and so I've heard a lot of stories of people as they're going through the grief process and watching the healing as it took place. And I can tell you quite honestly, too, that the way we work with people that come to us in grief today is so very different than how we did it 10, 15, 20 years ago. And I'll tell you what is different as we go through this presentation, so you will understand some of those things about the grief process that maybe you didn't look at before, some of those things that hopefully will be a little bit more clear to you. We're talking this evening about grief in the workplace. And the reason that title was chosen is you all, and myself included, work with people who eventually will leave us, some through death, some through going to other locations, and we become attached. And when they do die or move on, we do grieve. It's just a natural part of the human experience. But we come to work with our own grief. All of us have experienced personal grief. And then you come to work and you have more grief added to that. So we'll talk a little bit about how do you separate your own stuff from the grief that comes your way when you're working so closely and becoming so attached to the people that you work with. So I'd like to invite you as we go through this to ask questions, make comments, especially if there's a question for clarification, because I wouldn't want to leave and have people wonder about something and afraid to ask. And you don't have to be afraid to ask. You're among friends and co-workers, so everyone can feel pretty comfortable asking what's on your mind. So I did say we'd start with an overview. You do have some handouts, a handout in front of you, and some of the slides up here that I'll be showing you are not in your handout. I chose to put in your handout what I think would be most appropriate for you, and then added some things here for us to discuss. I have found that one of the successful ways of doing a program like this is to ask participants, such as yourself, what questions you may have about the grief process. Let's take a look at some of the questions that are real common, so you can be kind of thinking. If you have a question, what I'd like to do is write the questions down and make sure that it gets addressed during this talk. And if you think of something midway through that you didn't think of now, just raise your hand and ask, because that's why I'm here. what is that thing called grief? What is that really all about? Are there different types of grief? Or is grief grief? You know, are there different types of grief? This is the classic question, number 3. How long does it last? Often people, when they come in for grief counseling, they will say, yeah, I feel so sad. You know, how long am I going to feel like this? We'll address that topic as we go through this. Will I ever get over my grief? It's another real common question. And what do people do? You know, what do other people do to get through grief? And so I have several suggestions for you that will perhaps apply to your own life, and some things that you can tell other people along the way that may be able to help them get through this thing called grief. Do you happen to have any other questions, any other thoughts, things at this point that you would like to ask that I can add to the list?
I have one.
Good.
Do you ever have incidents where the survivor or someone very close to the deceased has such issues that they actually die within a short period of time from the loss of their loved one?
Very good question. Yeah, we can talk about that. That's very good. Any other questions or thoughts? A couple that I didn't add here is, one of them is, you know, does anyone not grieve? Yeah. Are there people that just don't grieve? We'll be addressing that. Excuse me. Another question, sometimes people say, well, do men grieve differently than women? Or is that all the same? So we'll address all these questions and then anything else that comes up, and I'll do my best to answer them. We'll take a look at these questions again at the very end to make sure everything is covered. Let's pause for a minute here. In the work that you do, the work that I do, we come in contact with a number of people that really have left an impression on our mind. And so let's just pause and think about a couple of those people in our own personal life, you know, family members who have died, that we are still grieving. And then you could turn your attention then to the workplace and think about some of those clients that you have worked with who have died. Just pause for a minute. If you wish to write your names down, that's fine. If you want to keep their names in your heart, that's okay too. But a couple of people from your personal life and a couple of people from your professional life that have died. It's always good to remember. It's always good to keep those memories alive of the people that we were close to. There is a Native American tradition that says that someone is not dead as long as they are being talked about. And so therefore, in some customs, the families would tell the story about the great-great-grandma or great-great-uncle and keep telling those stories over and over again to keep them alive in the memory. And I think we do that too, don't we? We tell those stories about our loved ones. And every time we tell that story, we keep them alive. You can picture them, you can laugh at some of the funny things that happened, you can be sad with some of those other occurrences, but we keep people alive by telling the story. I think it's very, very good to do. So maybe sometime you would like to tell, you know, a coworker, someone at the table, someone that you work with, who were those people that you chose tonight, and give yourself a chance to practice. Who was it from your personal life and who was it from your professional life working that you are still grieving? And bring your name up, and you'll feel better because of it, because you've kept a person's memory alive. Within grief work today, we use a lot of analogies. We look at things differently than we used to. Many years ago, when you go in for grief counseling, they may lead you through, you know, the stages of grief or the steps of grief. It was Kubler-Ross in probably 1968, 1969, that was really the pioneer. She got people talking about that. And she had different stages, you know, about the bargaining, the denial, and the anger, and the, you know, going toward the resolution. And that was really very helpful because at least we had a framework in which to talk. We don't use stages like that anymore. We still make reference to them. People still have all those feelings, so it isn't like we're saying the feelings don't exist. But what some people run into is the fact that if they are going through the grief process, and this has happened to me where people have come in and have said, you know, I'm just not doing this right. And you say, well, you know, what is it that you feel that you're not doing? Well, I'm just not angry, and I know that anger is one of those steps, and I'm just kind of waiting so I can get angry at something. I don't know what I should get angry at. So I thought, well, yeah, I would leave that one alone. You know, like who needs to be angry at this one. But people sometimes feel like they have to. There was a theorist that came out a while back and wrote a book. You know, sometimes people get these ideas and they write these books and they sell them. They make a lot more money than you and I would make. But someone had 14 different stages in the grief process. And I thought, do you expect me to remember that? You know, I could probably remember 10 out of the 14. But if you have to remember all 14, it's beyond what most people can do. Now, with those 14 steps, it's very common for us to encounter them. But we don't want anyone to think I have to grieve in a certain way, because grief just doesn't work that way. There's a very simple formula that I'll share with you toward the end that we use, which just has 3 questions. Now, I cannot remember 14 steps. I couldn't even come up with all of Kubler-Ross's things right now, so don't ask me to recite that. But I could remember 3 questions, and I'll share those questions with you later. It's in your handout, and it's something that will help you not only with grief through death, but other types of losses as well, because it does move on from there. Started saying that we do work with a lot of analogies. Sometimes it's good just to have a framework instead of that list, to take a look and use your imagination for working through the grief process. And this mountain that we have up on the screen here, we could call it the grief mountain. Often people feel like if you were driving along a road and you really had to get to the other side of the mountain, you get to it and there's a dead end. There's no road that's leading up that mountain. Sometimes that's how grief feels. It's like, you expect me to get over this grief, and there's no road, there's no path. I don't know how to do that. How many of you have ever done mountain climbing or been up at higher altitudes, you know, kind of walking around at a high altitude? What do you notice when you're walking up there? What's different than walking at sea level? Yeah, exactly. We could walk from here to the parking lot without much difficulty, but if we would fly to Denver and go up to Pikes Peak, much higher, and then walk that same distance, you may be really surprised you get kind of winded because you're at a higher altitude. We can use that analogy with grief. As you go up that grief mountain, you may find this is not as easy as it may appear, because it's going to require a lot more energy than you normally would expect. Grief can take away your energy, just like a high altitude can. Looking at that mountain, there's no pathway. So what we have to do when we're grieving in that grief process, we have to kind of find our own path. The path that I choose and the speed at which I choose to go up that mountain is going to be different than anyone else in this room. I may go for a while and then just go into denial and just don't have the energy to deal with it and then continue. I may go for a while and come back down, or you may be passing me up. There isn't a race to it by any means. And one thing that I think we need to know is you don't really get over it. You really don't get over that grief. Grief is such a thing in our life that it really is part of our being. That grief just becomes part of us, that we don't get over, we don't forget. But we can cope, and we can move forward in a way that is healthy and a way that is good for us. But what grief will do, I think, as you're walking up that mountain, you can begin to see life with a different perspective. Just like if you get into an airplane and you fly over the Twin Cities, you look down and there are the lakes and there are all the streets and it all looks kind of neat and orderly. You see the Twin Cities from a different perspective. And I think when you are grieving, you look at life differently too. You realize how fragile life is, how life can change so quickly, how people can come in and out of our life. So grief can remind us of a perspective of life, of how can I take care of myself so that I can prolong my life? What did I learn from this experience that I'd be able to help someone else that is in the grief process? We'll talk specifically about some of those things as we go through it. My title for a number of years before I moved into the management role was to be the bereavement coordinator. And I think most of us know counseling, it would have something to do with grief. They're dealing with a period of bereavement. They're dealing with that. Sometimes in the workplace, they allow a certain number of days as what we call bereavement days for people to go to a funeral. So it's really common. But I'd like to point out to you that the word bereave, actually, if you look it up in the dictionary, means to rob. Which is really interesting, isn't it? So those of us that have experienced a loss, grieve, so we're in this period of bereavement. And that period of bereavement is really like experiencing the healing after a robbery. Because when our loved one or loved ones die, or our clients die, we can feel robbed. We can feel something important was taken away from us that we didn't want to lose. And so therefore it's a robbery, and that's how it ties in. If we would go home after this presentation, walk into our house and found out that our house was broken into, that we were robbed, sometimes I don't think I would know what to do first. You'd be shocked. And you think, did this really happen? And is the robber still in the house? What did they take? Will I be able to get these things back? How long will it take before I feel safe again? Will it ever be normal for me? All those feelings that you would have with a robbery are very similar to those feelings that people have when they are going through grief. So if it's a sudden death, you hear about it, sometimes we think, that really didn't happen. It's that quick denial. Or, I'm just shocked. I can't even begin to think what to do next. When we go home and it's a normal day, you go home and check the mail, let the dog out, let the cat out, or whatever. Those normal things, we just know how to do that. But if we were struck with a grief incident, we may be so stunned that we wouldn't know what to do first, or who to call, or what to do. So we are definitely robbed when we are going through a period of grief. That's why they call it bereavement. So to be bereaved means to be robbed. Here's a definition of grief that we use quite commonly with the people in our program, and anyone who will listen to us talk, that grief is a natural response to a loss. It's natural to grieve something that is lost. We can experience grief physically, emotionally, and spiritually. And we'll talk about all those different levels of how that impacts us physically, emotionally, and spiritually. Grief takes time and attention to heal. And that's probably the key one way to look at it. Grief takes time. You really can't rush it. You can't think, okay, we have a wedding coming up in March, so I have to be done with this grief by then. It just doesn't work that way. You really can't rush it. And grief is as unique as your thumbprint. So if all of us in this room were siblings, let's say, and our mom died, we would experience that grief in different ways. Some people would grieve immediately. Some people would have delayed grief. Some people would just kind of put it aside and say, this is too much for me. We deal with grief in our own way. Just like walking up that mountain, we would do that differently. And we definitely grieve. The thing about the time and attention to heal, if I had a gash in my arm, say plate glass, hanging down and scraped me, probably would be so bad I wouldn't even want to look at it to begin with. It'd be very sore, it'd be very tender. It would heal best if I would go to the doctor. It would heal best if I would keep it clean, if I would keep it covered, if I would take the medication that the doctor recommended, if I would give it the amount of air it needed and cover it up at night. If you follow the instructions, it will heal, but it will always have a sign. You'll always know that's something that happened. Grief is the same way. If we have something in our life, a grief incident, and if we take care of ourselves, if we talk it through, if we process it, if we go through the necessary things for cleansing it, this grief in our heart will heal much better than if we ignore it and just put it on hold. So that's what we're talking about. What are some of those things that we can do to heal? I mentioned earlier all the theories, we had the 14 steps and the Kubler-Ross and so forth. The man that we follow now as far as the guru with grief theory, his last name is Bonanno, George Bonanno. With a name like that, you hope he's famous for something. So he's famous because of his grief work, and what he maintains and this is kind of what we believe, is that you and I are wired to heal. That it's our natural inclination to heal from an injury. So if you would break a tooth, your natural instinct would be, well, I can't come into work tomorrow, I've got a dental appointment at 8 o'clock, I have to take care of this tooth. If you cut your arm and you need to go to the emergency room, you're not going to say, well, maybe I'll go tomorrow. You would take action right away. Grief is no different. When you have a healthy person going through the shock and loss of grief, that healthy person will want to heal, but the process is going to take time. Years back, in grief therapy, someone would come in and say, really hurting, I lost my mother. And we would talk, and then sometimes grief counselors would say, well, what about, it's a nice day, why don't you just go out for a walk, and why don't you maybe stop and, get some coffee, or call a friend, or go out to lunch, or kind of come up with ideas that they can kind of come out of themselves and, kind of get with the rest of the program. We are realizing that's probably the most hurtful thing and harmful thing that a person can do. So in grief theory today, we believe people are wired to heal. We want people to heal. We believe that they do. But they may need to be in that pit of grief for a period of time. So when people come to us now, we ask to hear them tell the story, and they will tell it. They may come back a second week or a third week and just be in this complete sense of desolation and depression. They just can't get out of this. Eventually, and before too long, if you allow them to tell the story, they will start to say something like, last Sunday I went to church for the first time, and it was really hard, but I went back. So you can see that there's kind of that progression. They're starting to interact, and they're starting to get out of that pit. They say, well, how was that for you? Well, I sat in the back because I wasn't sure, and it really wasn't so bad. I think I'll go back next week. And I may even stay for the coffee hour. So you know that they're kind of moving through that a little bit. Now, it may take one person several weeks to get to that point. It may take someone else a lot less or a lot more. It all depends. But when you have a friend that is grieving, or you have a client that is grieving the loss, allow them to be right where they're at. I think we don't want to see someone suffer. You don't want to see anyone hurting. So we kind of come to their rescue, and I'll give you some ideas on how you don't have to be so hurting. Well, we're kind of doing that for ourselves. I don't want to see you hurting, so I'm going to try to pull you out. I'll give you all kinds of suggestions. The most loving thing you can do for people that you know is to allow them to tell the story uninterrupted and allow them to be in that pit of grief for the time that they need. The healthy person will soon move from that pit out, even if it's out just a little bit. But if it's out a little bit, acknowledge that and just say, well, how was that for you? Not that you say, well, next time you should do this. No, there shouldn't be any shoulds about it. Just leave them free to the point that they need to affirm that loss and allow them the time that it's needed. And think about the analogy of the wound. That wound is not going to heal faster because you tell it to get done faster. It will heal if you take good care of it. Taking good care of ourselves is allowing ourselves to be in that pit or allowing other people to, without coming to their rescue, without pulling them out. I tell you, years back when I heard that, I had everything to do not to be giving these friendly suggestions to people that would come in, because we're so used to making suggestions for how they can maybe move on with their life. And it was really hard to sit there and to allow them to grieve. But I do think after sitting it through, their end result was much better because they moved out at a time that they felt like they could. And there wasn't the expectation that you should be further along than this, because you don't want anyone to feel that way. Okay? So that gives you a little hint at the modern theory of what we look at grief. We are wired to heal, that we really go toward healing for body and mind and spirit. We don't want to be sick. We want to move on. Now, just as I said that, I could also think real quickly in my mind of some people that have come in and month after month after month are at the same point that they were in the very beginning. That happens. It's unusual. I mean, it doesn't happen real often, but sometimes it can happen where the grief is so embedded is linked with some other things that they haven't grieved yet, that they cannot get out of that very comfortably. So when that is the case, we refer them out to a psychologist or a psychiatrist that could maybe sift through the layers, because maybe in addition to that one loss that brought them in, there may be some other things that need some attention too. So we help them through that. There's a slide a little bit later that's good for all of us to take a look at. It's called cumulative loss. All of us have lost a number of things over the years. Some people can look at it and say, well, that loss was 15, 20 years ago. I was sad then, but I'm okay now. Some people lost something 10, 15 years ago and are still sad because now something else has happened that's reminded them. So it's really very, very complex, and we really have to work toward acknowledging it, naming it, and moving on the best that we can. We kind of want to keep things in a balance. We want to make sure that as we're in the grieving process that we pay attention to what may be missing in our life. And sometimes this is not in there, sometimes I'll just ask people, what is it that you miss doing? You really have spent time, maybe not going out, not doing things. What is it? Is there anything that you miss? And then sometimes, I really miss, not taking a walk. And then they start thinking, I really could do that. And so you want people to balance off their sadness eventually with other things, so that the sadness is, someone I mentioned last week in a workshop, she said that sometimes she'll deal with people and the sadness fills up their whole house in their imagination. And she said you want to get the sadness to go from a person's house down to a special room in the house, so that the sadness is not all over, but eventually it gets kind of contained, it's recognized, it's not going away, you're not in denial, but you're not seeing it at every twist and turn. Now that's so very hard for some of our elderly people that have lived in a house with their spouse for many, many years. The spouse dies, they can't move easily, but they have all the reminders around, and that can be a very difficult thing. So it's a good thing you come and go from their house to provide a diversion for them, someone else to talk to, and someone else that could be there in case they want to talk about something that is on their mind for that day. We talked earlier that there were types of grief, and sometimes people think, well, grief is grief. How could you have types of grief? Well, you can. And we can have what's called anticipatory grief. That's the type of grief that we experience when you know someone is going to die, but they haven't died yet. And you kind of think, wonder what that's going to be like when they are gone. What will that feel like? Have any of you ever had that experience where a loved one was dying and you kind of think, wonder what that's going to be like after they're gone? It's real common to be thinking, gee, what will that be like? The thing is, you never really know. You don't know until you go through it. You may think, okay, I'll be sad, the holidays are coming up, my birthday's coming up, this will be tough, but there will be things happening that I never gave that a thought, and it can really hurt. So anticipatory grief is the type of grief we feel before the loss. We anticipate, what's that going to be like? Complicated grief is the type of grief that we experience when there is, let's say, a sudden death that someone experiences, and then they've also just moved from one city to another, so they don't really know people, they're not established in the church or the community, and they don't have a support system, and yet they've got this loss, and let's say the cat just died. They've got all this stuff going on that can really make their grief complicated, because they sometimes don't know what they're grieving most. Am I grieving because of the loss? Am I grieving because I don't have a support system? Am I grieving because the cat died? Or all of the above? And so that becomes a complicated grief situation. Disenfranchised grief is a type of grief that often comes along with like pet loss, which is a big loss for us as well. Disenfranchised grief is a type of grief that you and I would feel, but maybe we're hesitant to bring up in public. Let's say I had a cat, and that cat I've had for, say, 14, 15 years. The cat was my best friend. And so when I would come home from work, I'd tell the cat how the day went, and just kind of be there with the cat, and the cat was affectionate and so forth. Well, if that cat died, that could be a devastating thing on the pet owner. If you're a pet owner, you would know what the loss of a pet can feel like. Now, if I had that loss and I came to work, I may not want to bring that up, because I may tell the wrong person that, I can't concentrate today. My cat died last And someone could look at you and say, what's the big deal? It was just that. Or get another one. I mean, that would be so hurtful. So because I may not want to bring that up, that's disenfranchised grief. You may not understand my grief, so I keep it to myself. If I keep it to myself, it's only going to get more difficult because I haven't had that avenue to share it with. So you want to find someone else that has had the same kind of grief so that you don't end up with that. Delayed grief, I don't know if any of you can relate to that. I actually can. Upon hearing sad news, sometimes it doesn't hit me until like the next day or 2 or 3 days later. And some of us that have delayed grief can be a real mystery to the people that grieve immediately because they'll look and say, well, you must be a mighty cold individual. You're not shedding a tear. Well, maybe those tears come a week later, 2 weeks later, months later. That is not unusual. So some people get the grief right away, and other people, especially if you're like the oldest in the family, you think, okay, dad just died, someone has to plan the funeral, someone has to call the relative, someone has to take charge. So you get so busy taking charge, because that's your role, your grief will come later. And so it's not to be judged. It goes back to that analogy of a thumbprint. It's as unique as your thumbprint. So that individual with delayed grief is going to grieve later and not experience it at the time. Unresolved grief, that's something that all of us here are sitting with. There's always something in our past that we have lost that still, when you see a movie about something, or you go into a restaurant, when I go into Baker's Square and see the lemon meringue pies, that's my grandmother used to make those. And so you see that as kind of a grief trigger. You think, oh, now I'm not as sad about the death now as I was, 30 years ago when she died. But still, there's kind of that unresolved grief. You think, I wish she was still here. Would I ever like to talk to her about what's going on? Whatever. Cumulative grief, we mentioned that briefly. That's when you have several losses and you don't know what you're grieving when. And normal grief. And that's an interesting thing, because normal grief can be a real wide range. We could have everyone in here experience normal grief, and that could be someone that starts to grieve immediately and gets help and goes through it. Someone else starts grieving at 6 months, and someone else who has much more of a delay. So normal grief has a real wide range. We can't be too hard on each other. If someone in your family is not grieving the way you grieve, remember the thumbprint analogy and say, their life is just different from mine. Their reality is different. They're wired differently. They will heal, but they will heal on their own time. So if someone says, well, I don't think grief is grief, you will now be able to tell them, well, no, grief isn't just grief, because there's anticipatory grief, accumulative, disenfranchised, delayed, many different types of grief that affect all of us in different ways. We're all on the spectrum. We all have all of these things to one degree or another. That's what makes us human, and that's kind of part of the human experience. Any questions so far? And then we say, oh yes?
There's one another kind of grief that I learned about that's called unspeakable grief.
Oh, okay.
Where, like, if you've had an abortion,
Okay.
or somebody in your family was murdered, and it's stuff you can't talk about really, and that you're ashamed of.
Right. And that is really hurtful. So we only hope that people that would be in situations like that would eventually find an avenue or a way to talk that through, or to be able to process it. To go to a therapist, which would be safe, or a trusted friend, someone who's had the same experience. Because you just need to get it out. You need to have it acknowledged. You have to be able to move through it in one way or another, and depends on whenever you do it. Whenever you do it is the right time. We realize that in grief work today, that the most effective thing you can do is talk through your grief experience. That's going to probably promote the healing more than anything else, is to talk it through with a trusted friend, with a therapist, with a clergy person, a coworker, a boss, to find someone that you can talk it through. Because something, you hear yourself say the story, and it's like, I really said that. And then you can kind of analyze as you're speaking. It's kind of a strange thing. Maybe you've had that experience. I remember once, several years back, a woman came in to see me. She lost her dad in our hospice program, but she also lost her son's best friend. Well, the son's best friend was like a son to her, because the kids were in and out of the house, and her son would be at their house, and their son would be at her house, and so she kind of helped raise him in that sense. He was in a car accident and was killed instantly, right around the same time her dad died. And so when she came in for grief work, usually what we do is we set a time limit. When people make an appointment, we have them come in for an hour like the time. It's much better to have that parameter, because otherwise people come in and they think, well, I'm here for the afternoon or what? You're here for an hour. And it's really helpful, especially when you're doing a home visit, because if you're in someone's home, they think, oh, you have another cup of coffee. Well, you want to make sure that you keep it to that time. And it's really very helpful, because if I say we're meeting for an hour, then you know that if they really have something to say, we remind you of about 10 minutes left. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you would like to talk about? And then you bring it to the next meeting, whatever is left over. But you don't want to get right to the last minute and have someone say, oh, by the way, I forgot to tell you, I'm suicidal. Well, that wouldn't be very helpful. That's like, why didn't you tell me that sooner? And in that case, we surely wouldn't say, oh, I'm sorry, your time is up. Could you hold that suicide until next week? And then you kind of can't do that. So you want to make sure that you have the opportunity well in advance of what you can provide. Back to that woman whose father and son's friend died, she came in and she was looking for some help. And this is a huge lesson to me, and hopefully it'll be a lesson to you as well. She came in, and I could tell she was just reeling in the pain. She told me all about her father's diagnosis and his admission to hospice, and how nice the hospice nurse was, and who all came, and then his decline and his funeral, and I kind of heard the whole works. And then she would kind of intersperse it with her son's best friend, and where the accident occurred, where she was when she heard the news, how her son reacted, what the family dynamics were as far as the change, and she went through in detail. And I, being the helper, was just sitting there and listening to her, and just asking her questions like, did that happen before or after? I mean, I wasn't asking really questions, I was just asking for my own mind to keep the story straight. And the hour came up, I thought, well, she's grieving 2 losses, and she was really so clear and articulate, just needed to talk. So we went for about an hour and 15 minutes, first speaking almost nonstop. And we got done, and I thought, I didn't offer her anything. And so as I was closing out, and it was time for her to go, I said, well, thank you for coming in and trusting me with your story. And her first comment was, this was so helpful. I thought, good. Because I didn't think I did a thing. And then I thought, well, my curiosity, and I said, what did you find to be most helpful? And that really wasn't anything I said. I didn't want to say that. And so she said, what was so helpful? She said, I never heard myself tell the story. She said, I've told people bits and pieces. My dad went into hospice. My son's best friend's funeral was, at such and such a church. Just I told people bits and pieces. I never heard myself tell the story. I tell you, since then, this was a number of years ago, it's been so different for me. The power of listening to someone's story, uninterrupted, and just allowing them to grieve, I think really gave her that framework. She told someone the story, and that someone could be you, easily. Because I think people don't expect to be healed. There's a very good book that's entitled, Please Don't Take My Grief Away. And I really like the title because when you and I are grieving, it's such a personal thing that if someone came up and said, well, here, I can take that away. You don't have to feel sad anymore. We would feel kind of cheated because we kind of need to process that grief. We need to sit with it. We need to remember. We need to really work it through. And if someone took that away from us, they would really be shortchanging us. So Please Don't Take My Grief Away, I think, is an excellent title and also a very good book. There's another very good book that's entitled Don't Let Death Ruin Your Life. And I thought, that's kind of interesting title for a book. And what this author does is she goes into explanations saying that some of the best works of art, some of the best poetry ever written, some of the best music that was ever composed was done by people who were grieving. Because she said they were so filled with passion, the emotions were right there, that they were able to transmit and transplant those emotions onto canvas, or using their pen, or using a musical instrument to express the grief. I found that to be really fascinating. Would you like to see what some of those works of art would be? And to have it pointed out that was done by someone that was grieving, and I bet you that I could probably tell. When you look at it, say, well, yeah, look at the detail. Now that can translate to other things. You don't have to be an artist or a poet or a musician to have that satisfaction. You can do something in honor of your loved one, as simple as painting a room in their honor, like their favorite color, planting a garden when it's gardening season, doing something special in their honor intentionally, even making bread. Taking someone's bread recipe and saying, Mom, this will never be as good as what you made, but I'm making this bread in honor of my memory of you. And then just do it with that intention. That bread will taste altogether different than it would have if it wouldn't have had that thought and feeling behind it, because it's something that you put into it. There was a woman that was openly grieving the loss of her husband, which was rather sudden. He was in the hospice program, but died faster than anyone would have expected, because sometimes that just happens. Nature takes a twist and turn, and this guy died. This woman was completely devastated. She, who had a anticipatory loss, she wasn't even at the point of anticipatory loss. She was, he's going to be okay, he's going to be okay. So she really was blindsided by this death. I was told by the staff that she was really having a hard time, so they said, would you please give her a call? This was in April, probably middle of April or so. So I did, and this woman was just not real happy to be talking to anyone, much less someone that was calling to remind her of what she had just gone through, which wasn't my intention to cause pain or anything, but I just wanted to say, how are you doing? And so after just a couple of minutes, she was cutting me kind of short. So I thought, okay, this really isn't going so well. And she said, I have to go. She said, I'm getting ready to put my garden in. This is mid to late April. And I just need to go out and kind of work with the soil. It's a beautiful day. And she said, I'd rather do that. In other words, she'd rather do that than talk to me. And so I thought, I could pick up the hint. And I said to her, I said, you must be a gardener. She said, yeah, I really am. And I said, so am I. I said, what are you going to put in the garden? Well, that conversation turned from this woman that was kind of angry about me even calling to her telling me what she was going to put in her garden. And so that twist was, and I said to her, have you ever thought about putting your garden in or making a special garden this year in honor of your husband by using his favorite colors, his favorite flowers? She said, I'd never thought of that. And so she said, I'm going to give that some thought. And I thought, okay, the connection's there. So I thought, I'm going to give you a call in a couple of weeks and check and see how it's going. So I put on the calendar, because you should hate to miss an opportunity like that. I called her, and she was like a different person. She said, I put it in. And she told me about her husband, his favorite colors, and so forth. Well, to make this long story much, much shorter, she and I then would talk as the summer would go on, and that was our conversation. How's your garden growing? And so I met her then that fall. We had a retreat for people in our bereavement program. And she came to the retreat. I hadn't met someone face to face, it was all over the phone. And she came with a series of pictures of her garden. She really wanted to show me what she did. She wanted to show other people too. Now, you can do this next year. And so she was using that as a means to express her grief. Because when people would come to visit her, they would say, that's a beautiful garden. And that gave her a reason to say, this garden is in memory of my husband. And he liked red, he liked, whatever. And then she could talk about it and gave her a good reason. It was the following year I thought, this is too good of an idea just to pass. So I had asked her, I said, would you mind if we captured your story and put it online on our website? And I said, if you could take a picture of your garden the first week of May, the first week of June, the first week of July, August, and September, I said, as I get your pictures, I'll just post them, and the people can see what you've done. They'll learn from your story. We'll catch them early enough before the gardening season starts, and maybe other people will be attracted to do the same thing. So she did, and she went on, and she got this stone that had her husband's name on it, and he was a farmer, so there was a tractor on it. She also had this implement, I don't know what you call it, like one of those plows, like a horse would pull, you kind of stand in the plow. She got one of those at a garage sale, so she put that in the garden, had some vines growing over it. This lady really went overboard with this garden, but it gave her something to do that she was proud of. So she was going to kind of follow, don't let that through her life. If she was going to do something to honor her husband and to give her a reason to talk about him in a very respectful way, and to pay tribute to him. So what started out as kind of this rocky road of trying to help someone really turned out well. You may want to ask someone that's a musician, have you ever written a song in honor of your loved one, or have you ever painted a picture, have you ever written a poem? And inspire them to do so. You don't have to be a genius. You just have to be someone that has passion and the time to do it, and to do it for themselves is very important. Whenever you are working with other people, always remember this. I think some of us fail to think about this. If you've ever flown in a plane, one of the first things that they tell you is, in case the air pressure drops and the mask will drop from the ceiling, put yours on first, and then assist other people. Because if you and I don't have our feet on the ground, it's really hard to help anyone else, isn't it? That to be grounded and to have feet on the ground. One of the things that you can do for people that you're working with, when you go into a home and someone is grieving and it's someone that you are seeing as client, maybe someone you really don't have a close relationship, you've got a business relationship too. You know, always remember the fact that when there's grief or when there's chaos going around you, think about this, doesn't have to be your client, it could be a neighbor that had a sudden loss, and you go in and you're not the one that's grieving, but they are. Always remember that people will migrate to the pillar that's in the room. Because if they are grieving, they're leaning on each other and they can't stand up because they're just too wiped out. But you will come in as an objective party, as someone who cares, who's empathetic and sympathetic, and you'll be surprised that they come to you because you are where the strength is. That will happen with your clients, it will happen in your own personal life too. But to do that well, you make sure that you have your oxygen mask on first, that you have your self-care done. Because it'd be really difficult to help someone else out of a crisis if you were in a crisis of your own. You really can't. You would have nothing to give, and you wouldn't be expected to give anything because you're in the process of doing your own work. So we talked about the physical reactions and mental and emotional and spiritual. I'm going to go through these kind of quickly because they are in your handout. And it is not unusual for someone to come in for grief work that will have some kind of physical symptom. I can't sleep well. I'm just not hungry. Or I am so hungry I eat everything in sight. There's many different physical things that I'm always tired. You hear that? A lot of people are just tired after a grief experience. Because as I mentioned before, grief can rob you, right? And so grief is robbing your energy. Grief is really taking a lot of things away from you. You can also be more susceptible to disease and to colds, so forth, if you are grieving because your immune system is broken down somewhat, depending on the loss and your own body makeup. But it's not uncommon to be sick within a period of time after a loss. The lump in the throat, the dry mouth, all those are real common experiences. But whenever someone comes up with an experience like this, a symptom, we always say, as it's down in the lower right-hand corner, it's always a good idea for people to check with their doctor. Because you and I would surely hate to say to someone that had this, this hoarseness of this lump in the throat, oh, don't worry about that, that's just grief. Because I know that you had a loss not too long ago. Oh my gosh, and that's to be something very serious. And we, told them, oh, don't go to the doctor because you'll get over it when the grief goes away. That would be kind of a dumb thing to say, wouldn't it? So people don't always go to the doctor right away, and they always feel that peace of mind when they do. And the doctor says, oh, your heart is beating faster, but that's normal for someone that's going through this. If you can normalize it, you feel a whole lot better. The mental reactions of the short-term memory. I don't know if this has happened to any of you as you're dealing with thinking about your past with grief. Sometimes we just have difficulty concentrating. People that could read and love to read books, I can't even get through a page because I get so distracted. And the fear comes in the minds of people. It's like, if I can't comprehend, is it only going to get worse? Is something happening to me? Did I lose it along the way? The answer is no. The answer is that you're probably so into this grief process that as time goes on, things will settle in. But right now, expect to feel kind of disoriented. And if they know, oh, I can expect expect to feel this way, they can relax, and then the tension doesn't rise along with it. So to expect those things, so sometimes the routine things just take much more effort, and people cannot really concentrate as well. For the emotional things, we talked about things like the sadness. We'll hear some of those signs of sadness, anger, depression, and so forth. That's kind of a spring off from what we have heard from many years ago. We can sometimes have the sense of the emotions come getting out of control. Sometimes people will just snap. Sometimes the calm and gentle will be so emotionally wrapped up in the loss that they may keep the lid on pretty tight and all of a sudden just get angry or start to cry. Where's that coming from? Well, it was all there, but it wasn't anything that they could release gradually. So to encourage your loved ones, encourage the clients that you deal with, as they need to cry, just to kind of be there and allow that to happen. Let that release valve, whatever that may be, activate into their life, and they will be much healthier in the long run instead of stuffing it. It's not always an easy thing to show emotions, but it surely is something that we can encourage, or just tell people in the privacy of your own home, if you like crying, just go for it. You make you feel better because of it. The spiritual reactions, people say, well, how does the spiritual life affect it? Doesn't it in a huge way? Because sometimes we'll ask those why questions. Why did that happen? Why me? Why now? What is that all about? Some people will be angry at God. Why did you take them? Why didn't you send a warning sign? What was that all about? Or some people may get closer to God because of the grace that came along with the experience that the death was so peaceful, the right people were there. So it could go one way or another with the spiritual connection that people feel. We want to try to make sense out of the loss. I tell you, it's so common when people come up and they say, I keep thinking about, I'm really at fault for this death, like if it's a hospice death. And I'll say, well, what makes you think that you're at fault? Well, I gave Mom morphine at midnight, and when I went to check her at 2 o'clock, she had died. And then the grief is on them thinking, I killed her. And then the question we say is, well, how often did the doctor say to give morphine? Well, every 2 hours. So what did you do the night before? Well, I gave it at 6 o'clock, 8 o'clock, 10 o'clock, midnight. And then they can kind of see themselves in the picture and think, well, yeah, I did it as scheduled. One of those doses is going to have to be the last dose. And they lovingly cared for their mother until the last dose was given so that she could die in comfort. But sometimes we just take that on. And it isn't until you can start talking to someone else about that you can kind of hear yourself say, well, wait a minute, one of those had to be the last. So you can kind of unwind the story by having a good listener. If someone's going to listen to you, it's going to be very helpful. Because if we don't resolve things like that, it's like going down the path of grief with a large boulder in front of you. So if grief can be mapped out as a pathway, and if you have this large boulder, in other words, it's the thing that you just can't forgive yourself for, you really can't move very fast down that path of grief. You're pushing that, and you're inching your way. But if you address what that boulder is all about, such as like the last dose, that boulder kind of goes off to the side. That grief road is going to be hard enough as it is, much less having this very heavy burden. So we try to have people come to us. If there is a question that they come up with that's beyond me, with the medical thing, we work with our medical director or physician, and I'll often just ask him, say, Dr. Sandler, would you mind calling this family and explaining to them? The doctor could say, well, tell them this, but it'd be me telling them. That isn't as credible, but he takes the time to call and say, this is, Dr. Sandler, and what can I do for you? And then they can tell the story in their own words, and he can pull the chart, or he can take a look at it. He spends a lot of time with people just making those things ordinary and normal for them, so that that boulder that's in the way of grief can be moved aside. It's very helpful to do that. Talked about cumulative loss before. Here's something that if we were in a workshop or had more time, what we would do is take a look at that and start listing what in your life has been lost that is instead of your briefcase, we'll call this the briefcase. And it is kind of interesting because you kind of start thinking, but not much. Well, some of those, losses of opportunities, some of those losses that we've had, some of those losses of possessions, there's just many different things that we have lost along the way, not only through death. If I was going to take a look at this and using it as kind of a simple example, let's say that I was 4 years old and had a hamster. Just love that hamster, never had a cat before. And if the hamster died, that might be the first loss that I as a 4-year-old would have ever had. Now that loss would be in the grief case, wouldn't it? Because it's like, well, I don't have a hamster anymore. Let's say that I go to first grade, and first graders usually like their teacher. I taught 7th and 8th. It was totally different by the time they, I don't know what happens. I should have taught first grade. I would have been a lot happier. But first graders usually like their teacher. So let's say that the first grader is in school, and it's, let's say mid-December, and the teacher says, boys and girls, I have a big surprise for you. The kids are all thinking, what's the surprise? And she says, when you come back after this Christmas break, you will have a new teacher because I'm getting married. Well, that little kid would be totally devastated that his favorite teacher, of all the teachers he ever had, which was the only one, would just feel devastated that that teacher is leaving. And that child could have a very heavy heart. So now this kid's got a dead hamster and the teacher that's gone in the grief case. As time goes on, as you and I know, there are friends that move away, people die, jobs that we didn't get, or just different things that we grieve, that we carry around with us. Some things stay forever, and some things in time kind of go away. Now, if I stood in front of you right now and said, I am still grieving the fact that my hamster died when I was 4 years old, there'd probably be something wrong with me, and I probably wouldn't be standing here talking to you all of that. At least if that was the case, I wouldn't tell you. But, if someone, in time, those grief things that were so serious, eventually just kind of fade away. They don't really hurt anymore. But what does make a difference is if you have a neighbor kid or a grandchild or a child that loses a pet at age 4, you will have that direct connection because you'll remember, I'm still on my grief case. I'm still kind of carrying that around. Not that I'm grieving over it, but I've had a similar experience. So be thinking, when you are going about your days, and let's say that you have a loss, a neighbor dies, a friend moves away, and you go and the client that you really were attached to is too sick or has died. Wow, those grief things can end up in our grief case and can be very, very heavy. So we suggest that periodically to take a look at what's in there now. And some days if you're feeling kind of out of sorts, you're not really sure what, it may be because you're carrying a lot of grief along with you. And just opening that case in your mind and just naming or thinking about those people can be very, very helpful. Because it's honoring them, it's giving them a place in your mind, and it's remembering the good things that they brought to you. And it's really continuing to work on the grief process, because the grief process really does not end. It changes. It does not end. It gets easier, but then it can creep up and get us in different, very, very strange times. Have you ever been watching a movie, and all of a sudden you see a scene that resembles something from your childhood, and you can start to weep because that reminds me of the time that whatever. There's a woman that told me the story that she was in either cut or rainbow, doesn't make any difference. And she was getting some soup. She was getting some cream and mushroom soup or something that she was going to put together. And so she was looking at the soup and locating it there. And her mom had just died, a few weeks prior. And as she was looking at the Campbell soup, she was looking for mushroom, but then right above was the chicken noodle soup. And she looked at the chicken noodle soup and she started to weep. Because her mom always made chicken noodle soup. The Campbell's chicken noodle soup, when she was a little girl, she had a cold or something was out of sorts. That was mom's way of showing affection. It was the chicken noodle soup. So she said, I was so embarrassed. I was standing there in the middle of the aisle in the grocery store and just weeping, looking at the soup. And she said, people probably thought, no, is it too expensive for this lady? Or, what's going on? But I think you get it as well as I do. Sometimes those things that you can't explain have such meaning and such power over us that even years later, now this happened soon after her mother died, which you can really understand, but wouldn't you think even to this day, several years later, as she walks by, she may not weep, but she'll look at that soup and say, oh, I wish Mom was here. I wish I had that one more time. So that the grief, it comes back and it kind of plays itself over and over and over again. It is kept in our briefcase. You know, like it or not, it is just part of how we are put together, how we are wired. I mentioned before that we use analogies a lot, and this is one that we use for family systems. So if you can imagine a mobile over a child's crib, or you see them in various spots, if you would remove any piece of that mobile, what happens? I mean, it just kind of goes out of whack, doesn't it? This mobile, even if in the best of circumstances, the door opens, the window opens, that thing is jostled around, doesn't, like any family system. I mean, no family is going to be that perfect mobile that never moves. There is going to be the time of some turmoil. It's going to come up and around. But if you take one of those pieces off, it's going to become off-center. So often when we're talking to people, we'll do a mobile diagram and say, you know, put the names of your loved ones in on this. So you have a name, you have a place for the immediate family, and then say, your mobile, because of your recent loss, is out of kilter. And the thing that's going to put it back so that it can work again is going to be time. As we talked about, that time is the healer. And the patience and the know-how just to kind of move it around so now once again it balances. It will balance again, but it will never be the same. Because it's missing a very, very important piece. That's the piece that you keep in your heart. So to think in terms of the mobile when you see one, in terms of, yeah, you remove anything from there, and how often that is for all of us with our family systems. You know, when you have a loss of a friend, a loved one, things are really out of kilter. And you may think, as I have thought too, will this ever be back again? Will it ever be like it used to be? And it won't be like it used to be, but it will work out better for some things. I mean, it will work out better in the sense that it will balance again. It will work better, but it will always be missing that very, very important piece. And that's what grief is. That's always remembering the pieces that aren't with us anymore. One of the things that we like to do to help people through the grief process, I mentioned to you that talking it through, the talk therapy is really, that's like number one in allowing the time. But just having that talking it through, we realize quite fully that not everyone likes to talk about their stuff because it's too personal, or I just keep it inside. We offer every year, usually do it January to February, a journal writing class where it's an online class where people are invited to, that we work within our program, to let us know if they want to participate, and we tell them about it. And for 4 weeks in a row, 4 Mondays, right at 9 o'clock in the morning, they get an email which has a couple of different types of writing exercises, and we put in YouTube videos of like a waterfall or soft music to get people relaxed, because when you're relaxed, you're more creative. And some of the writing exercises are things like sentence completion. I think, I feel, I want, I need, I miss. And it's all about getting those things that are inside you out and on paper. Very, very helpful for people. If you're ever interested in that or anything else that I talked about, my name and contact information is on the sheet. You can call at any time. I'd be very happy to help out. If you're looking for suggestions or you want to see that writing course or whatever, be happy to send it to you because we want to help as many people as possible. The very last week, after we go through 4 weeks, one of the things that we have people do is take a sheet of paper, number it 1 to 100, and start listing those things that you are grateful for. Earlier we showed that picture of that lady with the balance, and we've got the loss, which we got lost a lot. But we also want to be mindful of what do we still have. Now, someone came back from a workshop with that idea, and I thought, well, that sounds pretty good. You take a sheet of paper, number it 1 to 100, and start writing down what you're grateful for. I thought, how hard could that be? Well, it's not really easy to take for me. I thought, I had to leave work, go to a coffee shop, and take along a sheet of paper, number it 1 to 100, and I'm just going to write down what I'm grateful for. 537. And I thought, not what I write. But on my way home, I thought, oh, I forgot about music. And I do like it, and then just put on different composers and different songs. Well, all of a sudden, it went from 37 to 47. But what that exercise does is it tricks your mind into looking for things to add to the list. So the object really isn't to get to 100 in one sitting. Well, whoever made this exercise up was really brilliant because they had a big enough number that you can't get to 100 really easily. But you're starting to hunt for what else could I have? sorrow for losing someone, you can kind of say, I really am, because I've worked on this for the last 3 weeks with all this writing, but now it's time to maybe say, what do I have in life that I really enjoy? And that really is a very, very effective means of working on our stuff, getting the things that are in the inside of us out. This analogy, we talk about orbiting, is what they would call it in the Greek word. The loss, the individual who has died, is in the center, the sun in this case. And the family members are kind of like the planets going around that. As you can see from this simple diagram, some planets are much closer to the loss than others. Some are out of ways, and some are close. Some that are out right now might circle around and be very close as an event would happen and circle back out. So it's so difficult to really understand our family system because you and I, if we were all dealing with a grief, we would be at different parts. We'd be orbiting in different ways. Some of us would be kind of similar in it. Some people would be so far away from us we couldn't understand, what are you all about? Aren't you getting it? And maybe they get it very much, but they're just processing it differently. One of the questions that we'll be going back to, and we can deal with it right now, is how men and women grieve differently. And I really hate getting into, well, men do it this way and women do it that way, because that really isn't true. So rather, I'd like to say some people grieve internally and some people grieve externally. And it's quite common for men to maybe not show emotion. So that would be internal, but there are a lot of women that grieve internally and not really show the emotion. There are some men that grieve openly very easily, and some women that do too. So it really isn't necessarily a male-female thing as much as it is a preferential style. Some people may say, I'm not going to grieve in front of people, but you don't know what they do in private. They may, like a man may go up to his garage and start working around in the garage fixing something, and tears will be flowing. So it doesn't mean that because you're not showing it. Some people do it internally, some people do it externally. That journal writing activity that I mentioned is a great thing for the internal, just kind of getting out what's on the inside, realizing that we're all orbiting. And it's interesting then, after doing that, writing to look at that, those entries a year after, and say, I can't believe where I was a year ago. Look at all these issues that I had, but they have kind of resolved because I've given them time and I've worked on it, and so therefore it's better now than what it was. Earlier, I told you that there was a formula that had 3 questions, and I would really hate to not include the 3 questions for you. This is called transformative grief. The person that came up with it, his name is John Schneider. So unlike Kubler-Ross with their 6 steps, and wherever the other person was the 14, and it's all kind of beyond me. But John Schneider, I like what he says, because he said all you have to do is focus on 3 questions. You have to first of all ask yourself, what is lost? And then you move to, well, what is left? And the third question is, what is possible? It works for dealing with death, and it works for moving from one house to another. Because taking the house example is, what is lost? Let's say that you move from, Anoka to Farmington, just this, to different parts of the Twin Cities. Well, what is lost is, the neighbors. You can't take them with you. Maybe you're very close to them. What is lost is the church community, because you're not going to be going from Farmington, up there for church. Maybe once in a while, but it'd be rare. The doctor's office, the school system. So all those things are kind of lost because you've moved. Okay? So you can have several losses that are really involved with that. What is left? Well, you've got the furniture, you've got all those reminders. What is left are the relationships. They didn't go away, they just changed. What is left is you have the skills to kind of find a doctor and the church community and so forth. And then when you get to the what is possible, it's possible to like this new location. It's possible to like this new location better than the old one. It is possible. Sometimes when people come to us in grief, they will say, I can think of one man in particular who lost his wife, and we spent a lot of time talking about her because that was the loss. And she was the co-parent, the best friend, the travel companion. So this man, kind of listed all those roles that she had. It wasn't like, I lost my wife. That's true, but she had many different ways in which she impacted his life. And then we went into, eventually, to what is left. Well, the children, the memory, her favorite sayings, her recipes, her legacy. So not all was gone. Big part was gone, but not everything, because there were many things left. And then what is possible? He eventually came up, it's possible to heal. Because now this is several months down the road. He said, I feel so much better now because I have re-entered the church community, I'm exercising, I'm doing things. He said, you know what's really possible for me? He said, I always loved working with dogs. And I live in an apartment, I cannot have a dog. But I discovered an opportunity at the Humane Society. They look for volunteers to walk dogs. And he said, that's what I do. So he goes twice a week to walk dogs at the Humane Society, and he's just thrilled. Because this is possible. It wasn't possible before for a couple of reasons, because he couldn't have dogs in the apartment, but his wife was too sick. He couldn't leave her to be doing that kind of volunteer work. Now there's that possibility. And along with doing the walking the dogs, he's meeting new people and really expanding his social network, expanding his support, and really becoming, a lot more engaged. Does he still miss his wife? Definitely. It's very hard coming back home to an empty house. But look what he has done. He has begun to look at what is possible for me, and that possibility to heal, or as I mentioned earlier with Bonanno saying, you and I are wired to heal anyway. So we have to move toward that in our own time and in a way that makes the most sense for us. So when we talk about, what do you do in regard to grief and loss, this is all in your handouts. I won't read it all through to you, but I'll point out a couple of things. One thing that I'd really like to emphasize is the E for the care about the exercise. We really strongly suggest that people move to the extent that they can, because moving, exercise will be the release of endorphins. That's our body's natural way of healing. And so if it's someone that is in a wheelchair that they can't get up and do anything, even if they do something with moving their arms and kind of engage in some kind of activity, either to music or just by some kind of movement that they can have, anything that they can do to exercise, and that's going to help. For you and I that can get up and around, it's really helpful if we are out exercising, because if we exercise, we'll get hungry. Hopefully when we come in, we will choose nutritious food, because that helps too. Our bodies are really depleted, robbed, if you will, of the nutrients when we are grieving, because it takes it away. What we typically go to are the comfort foods, the mashed potatoes and gravy and the meatloaf. All those kind of appeal to us sometimes when we're grieving. Probably the worst choice we could make. Good once in a while, don't deny yourself completely, but to really look for those nutritious foods that can help replenish our body, because it has been robbed of some of those important things during the grief process. So the nutrition and then the exercise would be something that would be very good. It's good for all of us at any time. And so the second point, when people are saying, I didn't do enough, probably heard that, you can easily hear that, I didn't do enough. Sometimes it's good just to pause and say, well, what did you do? And when they start making a list of those things that they did do, they think, oh, I guess I did all right. One woman came in, her mother was in a nursing home. She had 2 little children. She would go to the nursing home to bring her mother's laundry home because she didn't trust that, what would go through the laundry at the nursing home that her mother was at would actually come back to her. And so she took the laundry home. She was taking care of 2 little kids. She would make her mother some favorite meals and bring it to the nursing home. And when she was grieving, one of the things that she told me, she said, I didn't do enough. And she said, my dear mother did so much for me my whole life, and I really shortchanged her. And so then it was, she had just told me about the laundry and about bringing things. And I had asked her this when we got to that part, it was toward the end of the visit. But I said, when you come back next week, I said, come back with a list of the things that you did do. And when she did, she could have that. It's that perspective again. It's like going up the mountain high enough to look down. She could say, well, I did do several things. So she was kind of pushing that grief boulder along, thinking, I didn't do it well enough, I didn't do it well enough. She could remove that boulder and say, I did all right. There's another book that's entitled Your Best is Good Enough. And I think that's even if just the title alone is good to know that there's a book written on that, because you and I want to do the very best for someone. And sometimes what we do is as much as we can do under the circumstances. And your best is going to be good enough in many cases. That woman that had the 2 little kids couldn't be with her mother 24 hours a day in the nursing home. It just didn't work out that way. Her mother wouldn't expect it either. So when you kind of unravel the story, you can just see how it can play out. The last one on this particular page is paying attention to your dreams. I find dream work to be extremely fascinating, to learn what our dreams might mean, what they're trying to tell us. We have a woman that we work with who's a dream therapist and works with us doing workshops for people in our bereavement program that come and need to hear about why we dream and how we dream and how we remember dreams and what colors mean and numbers and so forth. They come one week and kind of get the background. The next week they come and they share dreams, and she kind of begins to work with them to ask questions about, and many of the dreams that they come back with are centered around the loss. Maybe they're dreaming about the person who died, or just dreaming about something. Like I dream like I'm stuck in the mud, like I can't move ahead. And she'll say, well, what in your life parallels that? Well, I'm kind of stuck in my grief. So she kind of helps people take their dream world, translate it to what is really happening within them, and how helpful that is. Now, if you want more information on dream work, check it out. We have got some good resources for you. She's just a gem to listen to. I've listened to her many times. Each time I learn something. And actually, I've gone to her a few times personally and say, what do you think this means? And she actually welcomes the chance to talk to people about their dreams, because she's kind of on this mission in life of helping people understand the importance of the dream world. So I think that's really a good thing to do. Okay, so the self-care things continue. The last one on this was to breathe. That's kind of a helpful thing. If you just kind of sit down and relax and breathe, you'll probably be doing a whole lot better. I listed some things that you may want to do as a staff. When there is a loss, to attend the funeral, to send a card, and in that card to have some kind of personal mention of what that individual meant to you. So if it's a woman that dies, that just had a beautiful smile, to write to her son or daughter to say, I'll always remember your mom, and when I think of her, I'll think of that beautiful smile, or how kind she was. So those things are treasures to the family. To call the family, to remember them on birthdays, anniversaries, just to remember people is really so very important. One other thing about the grief world that I don't want to forget to tell you is that statistics show that when we have a death, it sometimes takes like 4 to 6 weeks afterwards. We're kind of in a fog for many of us. 4 to 6 weeks after the death, the pain can really drift in. This really happened. Everyone else has gone back to work. I'm back at work. People aren't asking me anymore how I'm doing. And this is really hurtful. Another time along that first year where grief can really be accentuated for people is right around the 6-month time period. There was a study in Boulder, Colorado, a number of years ago, where they asked people that had a loss a couple of years out, when, during your first year, did you run into some emotional crisis with the grief? Many people said 4 to 6 weeks. They have their check mark there. But a large number, right around 6 months. So right around 6 months is kind of this peak. We don't know exactly why that is. Like, why not 5 months or 8 months? But it's great for you to know that. So as you have a friend, relative, client that is experiencing grief, and it's right around the 6-month mark, and they're thinking, I was doing fine until now, and now I'm probably spiraling out. I'm really feeling sad. You can encourage them by saying, the fact that you feel sad at this point means you're probably right on target. Many people, for whatever reason, experience that intense grief right around 6 months. Isn't that strange? It bears itself out. We often see people, they'll call us, you have to set up a grief counseling appointment. And when you go to the chart to see when the loss was, it's not uncommon for it to be right around that time. And they can come in thinking, oh, I'm going to spiral down. It's going to go from bad to worse. When we assure them that in most cases, you're probably right on target, they can kind of relax. And you can almost see the relief. Oh, okay, you've heard this before? Say, yeah, I wish I had $1 for every time I heard it. Be kind of a good experience if that was the case. So, I know we've got just a few minutes left, and I'd like to go back to the questions at the beginning and answer those to make sure that we have them addressed. And then any other questions that you may have, And there's many different types of grief. We talked about anticipatory grief, cumulative grief, delayed grief, complicated grief, and so forth. The types of grief, and there are two. How long does it last? That's a good question. It kind of lasts forever. It lasts forever, but in different degrees. So it's not always with the same intensity. It may peak in intensity, around the holidays. It may peak around a birthday, anniversary. But then the longer you go, when it gets, when it goes to a peak, it usually doesn't stay as painful for as long a time as it did before. That's a good measurement of it. How do people get through grief? We talked about, the journal writing, that's one way to do it. And if you don't remember anything else, remember the thing about the talking. You're talking it out or getting it out. Maybe that'd be a better way to phrase it. To get it out through talking, through writing, that's a huge, helpful way of dealing with grief. Paying attention to your dreams, getting support from support groups, talking to trusted friends, learning what you can about grief, normalizing grief. Don't be ashamed or afraid to go to a grief counselor. Again, I have my name and number here, and one of the things with our hospice program and hospice programs throughout the country is we are committed to help people in the community with their grief. So even though someone says, well, I really wasn't part of the Fairview system, I went to Lina or North, but I know you, can I come in or could you answer this question? Definitely. That's why we are here. And we do not charge for the work that we do. You can keep that in mind too, because that's something that people think, well, I could never afford to go to a grief counselor, I couldn't afford to make an appointment, or if I call, how much are they going to charge? Well, the answer is zero. We'd be glad to help out in any way that we can. Does anyone not grieve? That was a question that I added to this, and the answer is yes. There have been a few people that have come in that will say, well, here I am, I don't know what I'm doing here, but I don't feel any grief at all. When they say that, there's a story behind it. So tell me about who died. Now let's say it was, someone says, just making this up, my husband died. Oh, well, how long were you married? What can you tell me? Well, we were married 45 years. We have 4 children, they all live in the area, we've got good support. It's not grief. Then you get into, what's the relationship like? Well, once they can kind of trust you, when the floodgate opens. And you could hear, he was physically, emotionally, and verbally abusive for 40 of those 45 years. To the point where it's been said, I couldn't wait for him to die. Because now I am finally free. Now the struggle with that is, the neighbors don't always know that. So here's this grieving widow that is expected to be, really in the depths of grief. And, she's singing the Alleluia chorus in the house because it's, like, oh my gosh, it's gone. But of course you can't sing that too loud because people are wondering, what's that song all about, But, that's really the theme, isn't it? But as we talked, I said, I think you are grieving. And she said, no, I'm not. and I said, no, I think what you're grieving is maybe the fact that it's a loss of a dream. I said, how did you feel 45 years ago when you walked down the aisle to get married? And she said, this is the most wonderful man. She said, it was the happiest day of my life. And then, she started to cry and said, I had all these hopes and dreams for a long, long life together. And she said it didn't happen. So what we came to is really, she was grieving the loss of a dream. The dream was to have this happy marriage. It didn't happen. So she came in, she wasn't grieving, but she left grieving. So that's part of my role too. So if you come in and you're not grieving, we'll make sure that you find something to do. No, our whole purpose is to help you heal, help you move toward healing, and maybe just that twisting that story backward for her helped her to heal, because she would realize not all is lost. Maybe I have a choice of thinking about those early days instead of dwelling on some of those negative things which are really hard to get rid of. But maybe she could begin to kind of balance it out and see, once again, this grief from a different perspective. So, I'm going to stop there because that's all I know about grief. I hate to start saying more and start making up stuff. Is there anything that you have questions on? And I don't want to put you on the spot, so if you're thinking of something, I don't want to raise your hand. I'll be around for a few minutes afterwards, but you can contact me later through email if you're calling if there's a question or a comment. time. Thank you for sitting through it. I don't think anyone fell asleep. That after dinner, sometimes that can be a challenge. But thank you for hanging in there, and I hope you found